Good morning, everyone. I'm Eric Michael Garza. I'm one of the ELC advisors and a member of the ELC's Professional Development Committee. Thank you for joining us this morning for this important and timely conversation. Welcome to our ELC members, new and old, and also welcome to those joining us today who are interested in learning more about ELC. We're glad to have you. United Way's Emerging Leaders Council began in 2014 to engage young professionals ages 21 through 45 in United Way's work to strengthen the greater San Antonio community. Through philanthropic efforts, networking, volunteerism, and professional development opportunities, ELC supports the United Way in uniting our community to identify and solve our most critical issues like inequities that are all too common in our city. At this time, I'd like to invite United Way's President and CEO, Chris Martin, to share a bit more about United Way's efforts to create and support more equitable outcomes in our community.
Thank you, Eric, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning as we have our conversation about the issues of diversity and equity and inclusion. 3 years ago, our United Way embarked on a journey that was really about strategically realigning the work that we do and realigning it into impact areas that address inequities in our community. And if you think about our mission, it really made sense, right? The mission of United Way envisioning a diverse and thriving San Antonio, free of racism, where everyone has the opportunity to achieve their full potential. That's the work of United Way. And we remain committed to the strategies that advance our most burdened neighbors in this community, and we're focused on reducing the disparities by race and gender. United Way addresses these inequities in a number of ways. And if you think about the work that we're doing on a daily basis, we're doing it in these tangible ways. It's about investing in home visiting programs to find and serve families that don't have access to prenatal care, making sure that access exists for every person in our community, every future mother in our community. And more importantly, the impact that it has on not only the mother, but the child as well, the long-term impact that it has on the child. We're also focused on improving the availability of quality childcare centers, and we have a number of childcare deserts in our community, and making sure that we support parents so that they can seek continued education as well as work in their lives. And then also being focused on engaging and guiding youth back into education and employment opportunities as we address the issue of disconnected youth in our community. A disproportionate number of them are from minority communities in San Antonio. And we have, as a community, we have got to find a way to engage them if we're going to be a stronger San Antonio for the future. And then also being focused on supporting family-centered, two-generational approaches that address the challenges that are created by poverty and inequity and have been created for years. And being focused on that to help those families move forward and strengthen themselves so that we can strengthen our community. And then also being focused on tackling the wage disparities between women of color and white male earners in our community. If we find a way as a community to address that issue, again, we will be a stronger San Antonio. So let me say thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for your support. Community change doesn't happen overnight. And this is a long-term investment by our United Way. This is a long-term investment by our community. But the bottom line is we're committed to changing lives, not only today, but also changing lives for future generations. And if we do that, our community will be much better off in the long run, not only for today, but for the future and for the children of the future. So with that, let me say thank you so much, and I'll turn it back over to Eric.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for your leadership. I know our city is lucky to have you. So before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know that today's panel is going to be recorded. It'll be posted on United Way's YouTube channel, United Way SATX, hopefully by next week. Also, we have reserved a part of the presentation for questions and answers. That'll be once the panel discussion wraps up. So please stay on for that. So let's get started. This morning, we are excited to have a panel comprised of representatives from the corporate, government, and higher education sectors of our city, and are grateful for their willingness to elevate this conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome our moderator, Kieran Baines. Kieran is the Director of Community Impact at SA 2020, where she works with multi-sector organizations to strengthen their impact on San Antonio's shared community vision. She previously served as the first Chief Equity Officer for the City of San Antonio. And prior to joining local government, Kieran worked in international development and peace building in South Asia and East Africa. A proud first-generation college graduate, Kieran is a fellow alumna of and holds a bachelor's in international relations from St. Mary's University. Go Rattlers. I know Kevin's out there doing the Rattlers sign. And she also earned a master's in peace studies from the University of Notre Dame. Kieran was recently named a 2020 Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equity. So I realize this is Zoom, so please feel free to use the applause reaction or unmute to help me welcome Kieran as a moderator. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Eric, for that introduction. Thank you, Chris, for talking about United Way's commitment to advancing equity. And shout out to Jordan Thomas, who is the United Way organizer behind the scenes that has helped make this happen. I know with the D&I committee at the Emerging Leaders Council. Thank all of you. At this moment, our time is precious, and we are living through a global public health crisis. And so I am so grateful that folks are tuning in today, that the panelists have come together today to talk about their respective work as it relates to advancing equity, because of how critical that work is at this moment. And of course, it's always been. The panel today, I'm very excited about. Dr. Myron Anderson, to do a brief introduction, is the founding VP for Inclusive Excellence at UTSA. Dr. Anderson comes to us from Denver, where you were also working within the role of President for Diversity with a background in the School of Education. Your work is very close to my heart, Dr. Anderson. I'm a first-generation college graduate myself, care deeply about sense of belonging on campuses and how that shifts student outcomes. And I know your research and background is very much in campus climate, diversity, microaggressions. And you have a PhD in instructional technology, which I've already told you, I don't know what that means, but I know that I need your support every day at this moment. You are the person that I want to go to during this crisis that we're living through, and how so many of us are forced online for all of our work. Thank you for being here, Dr. Anderson. We have Zan Gibbs, who currently serves as the Chief Equity Officer for the City of San Antonio, a position in an office that's very close to my heart, joined by Jonathan Malagone, who I know will also be jumping in for the Q&A. So thank you both for representing our city government's Office of Equity. Zan came to San Antonio from Portland, where you were serving as the Equity and Inclusion Manager in the Transportation Department. There's such a deep history of the relationship between equity and transportation. So I'm excited to do a deeper dive into the work that you're leading for local government and how it relates to every other sector in San Antonio and across the country. And before working in the public sector, I know that you have a background working for many, many years, decades in the nonprofit sector, which obviously we're with United Way, which has specific programming, is also a funder. So we're really seeing the breadth of opportunity to advance equity in different sectors by all of you today. And I know your master's is in public health, so also another person that we super want to hear from at this moment. And finally, we have Jacob Cavazos. I know folks know you, folks are familiar with you because you are on the D&I committee, is that right? Or you're a part of the Emerging Leaders Council, but D&I committee for Broadway Bank. Did I get that right, Jacob?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Jacob is the Senior VP and Community Reinvestment Manager at Broadway Bank. Before that, has experience working with Frost Bank, both in San Antonio and in the Valley. You're also a board member for Communities and Schools of San Antonio, which is a nonprofit partner of SA 2020s. So shout out to Jessica Weaver and the entire team and the great work that y'all are doing there. And Jacob, I think we should tell folks that we know you are not wearing pajama bottoms.
That's correct. Full on suit today.
Yeah, this is very serious, this conversation. To get us started, if I could actually start with you, Jacob, a question that I want to ask all of the panelists, which Eric touched on in our introduction, right? That y'all represent three very distinct and different sectors We heard from Chris and Eric that we're talking today about diversity and inclusion. We're also talking about equity, and y'all have very different relationships and touch points, but great synergy across different sectors. Jacob, can you tell us what exactly do you do? Then we'll pass the mic to the other panelists as well, and why it is important to the people that you serve.
Sure, absolutely. And I guess first and foremost, thank you so much to the United Way for having me and the ELC for inviting me to be a part of the panel. It's a great honor to be a part of the conversation. So coming from the private sector, my piece is probably a little different than the rest of the panelists, but I manage the bank's community reinvestment, community development efforts across the footprint of the areas that we serve. So San Antonio, Austin, Kerrville, Fredericksburg, the general South Central Texas area. And that really includes ensuring that our community development services, what we're doing out in the community, outreach, education, our investment dollars, our donation dollars, where we're putting those, where we're investing those in area nonprofits that are serving the community, and our community development lending. So basically, where are our dollars going? Are they equitably dispersed across the areas that we serve? Are we making impact? Can we show the impact that we're making in the community? That's really the crux of it. And then from the DE&I perspective, I'm privileged to serve on as a subcommittee chair for the community arm of our DE&I efforts. We've got a group of passionate bankers there that are excited to be doing work in this area, and so I'm just privileged to be a part of that. But like I said, thrilled to be here and part of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. I think that's a perfect segue, Zan. I want to hear more about Office of Equity. What do you do in relation to our city government, and why is it important to the people served by our local government?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, Kieran Baines, for facilitating this excellent panel, and United Way for inviting us all here today. My name is Zan Gibbs. I'm the Chief Equity Officer for the City of San Antonio's Office of Equity. We owe a debt of gratitude to Kieran, actually, for sort of forming, storming, and norming the first components of this office. So it started out as a diversity and inclusion office, and then Kieran was able to get it converted to an Office of Equity in 2017. And that was because we recognized collectively as a government, as well as a nation, that really equity should be at the front and center of this work within government. And one of the reasons is because government has started to recognize, slowly but surely, that structural racism is still embedded in the way that government functions today. So sort of this long history of racist policies and programs within government has created a lot of disparate impacts and outcomes, primarily in communities of color, but also low-income communities. And San Antonio is not exempt from that. So we recognize that disparities across all major domains are really wide and deep. So our office, I like to call it the social justice arm of the government. So when people say, what do you do? I say, well, I have the great honor of talking about racism every day with all of the city departments, and really talking to all of these city departments about what we do to address structural, systemic, and institutional racism within all of our city departments. So in some ways, we're kind of an internal service department. So we serve other city departments because we think that our reach as a small group of 5 staff is going to be stronger if we focus on really leading the work inside across all 40 city departments. So we're a huge government. We have 13,000 city employees. So what we do is we do racial equity action plans in departments. We train up to 100 staff to be equity trainers in their departments. And we organize a cross-departmental citywide equity committee so that we can really have 50 people across all departments kind of acting as the centralized strategic equity think tank. And they're the ones that we train to apply tools in their departments. So really quick, I'll close out by saying one example is they are all trained on using a budget equity tool within their departments. So every city department is required to take a budget for equity exercise sort of through the budgeting process every year. And it very specifically looks at racial equity and economic justice principles. So we're really excited about that, and we love that we get to sort of work across all departments internally and really help them grow their knowledge about what is equity and what does it mean to sort of focus on dismantling racism within government, within our institutions.
Zan, before we pass the mic, I'm going to actually ask you, because of course, part of this work, as you've said, right, is normalizing and making sure we have shared language. And I know the Office of Equity advocates for intentionally using a definition of equity. Can you tell us about that definition? What does equity mean?
Sure. So one of the definitions that we really like is equity means at the end of the day, our goal is that your identity does not predict your outcome. So that's sort of our simplest definition at this juncture, is that through dismantling racism and sort of advancing economic justice, we want to live in a San Antonio where your race, your ethnic identity, your class and income status do not predict your outcomes, right? So they don't predict your health outcomes, your housing outcomes, your educational outcomes, because right now they do. So we recognize that identity, because of these systems of oppression, not because of individual decisions as much as it's about the systems that have really created these disparate outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for that, Zan. I know in San Antonio, like around the country, as quickly as equity became utilized as a concept, it started to also kind of feel like it was losing its critical mileage. And so I always appreciate hearing the definition and being reminded that it is both a process and the outcome and about improving people's lives. Dr. Anderson, what does it mean to be the Vice President for Inclusive Excellence at UTSA, and why is it important by the students served by UTSA?
So it's exciting what it means. Thank you for allowing me to be here, and thank you for United Way and distinguished guests and my colleagues on the panel and folks that are in attendance and viewing this recording. I'm happy to be here. It's exciting to be a part of Inclusive Excellence at UTSA, and what it means is I have an opportunity to work with everyone, really all across the areas of the institution, the faculty, staff, the students, within the departments, within the majors, within the curriculum. And so it's just a great opportunity to infuse this philosophy of inclusive excellence throughout the institution. And that's the name of the office, but that's also the name of the work. There's a theoretical framework that's been designed around inclusive excellence that allows us to develop a strategy, or what I like to say is just basically, in a nutshell, create an environment where faculty and staff and students can thrive. Very simple. So if you want to say, what do I do? That's what I do every day. I just work with people across the institution to help create an environment where faculty and staff and students can thrive. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what I do. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to show a little bit more about this perspective of what the work that I get to do, that I have the privilege of doing at UTSA. And when you talk about how you're going to do it, you know, I've designed what is called the inclusive excellence ecosystem. And hopefully you can see this on the screen. And if not, let me know. And if you look at this ecosystem, which is right here in the middle, this is how you do it. This is how you create an environment where faculty and staff and students can thrive. And as you can see, there's a lot of moving parts here. But the goal as the inclusive excellence facilitator, champion, and/or chief diversity officer, this is what we do every single day. You can pick this apart, but when you look at it, you've got to work with committees, affinity groups, cultural intelligence, initiatives on campus, strategic planning, recruitment and retention of our faculty, staff, and our students, developing programs, community engagement, campus climate. All these things get to happen, and they don't happen linear. It's not a linear process. They happen actually all at the same time. So the exciting part of my work is I get to work with people who I facilitate their actions in regards to doing this work. So it's not just done in one office, it's done throughout the campus. Hence the name inclusivity, hence the name excellence, and all these things we hope will, and we have research that supports us moving towards a greater sense of belonging from our students, from our faculty, from our staff. It's about everybody. And with this strategy of inclusive excellence, everybody's on this team. This is not a team of one or two or a team of a different race or a team of a gender or a team of able-bodiedness. This is a team of the entire whole of UTSA with the goal of moving towards excellence and believing that inclusion is how we get there. So everybody's my teammate. So I have a teammate of over 30,000 people. It's exciting to work with 30,000 people every day. So that's a little bit of what I did.
Dr. Anderson, when did you move to San Antonio from Denver?
I moved here January 2019, I believe it was. Yeah.
Why don't we know each other?
Why don't we know each other?
Yes.
I don't know. You were in Denver for a while? Oh, I didn't know that.
No, I'm from San Antonio and I've been here a minute. But I'm listening to you and I'm like, hey, why don't I know you? Why don't I know about this? Thank you for sharing that image. Yeah. I am a giant nerd. It's hard for me to be the moderator on a panel about advancing equity because I want to be a panelist and not the same, different. Two things. I want to keep the mic with you, Dr. Anderson. I want to let our participants know that we are paying attention to the Q&A. So as you're hearing from folks talk about what it means to be advancing equity or leading diversity and inclusion work in these different sectors, please drop your questions in. I'm eager to hear what the kinds of thoughts and reflections are coming up from you, and then we'll also engage on those questions. I also want to hear, Dr. Anderson, so because I'm a big nerd, one of my favorite thinkers in advancing equity is John A. Powell at the Othering and Belonging Institute. I know I'm in good company. I see Zan nodding her head. And there's a concept called targeted universalism, right? That says if we have a shared universal goal, which of course, as the person at SA 2020, we know the community has written together community results, shared goals that they want to see for the future of San Antonio under San Antonio's shared community vision. If we then start to look at how we can achieve those shared goals, we can maximize our impact by ensuring that our policies and our services and our programs are targeted, created with and for the folks who need it the most. So when I look at the work that you do at UTSA, my brain went to, are there examples, are there things that come to mind for you? Are there more diagrams you can show us that really prove this point? That there are particular policies or programs at UTSA that you've witnessed or initiated or led, where you've been able to see that it has benefited the entire campus community?
So yeah, there's a couple of things that I could share. And I want to, and I got a chance to meet Zan before we, it was an exciting conversation before the pandemic. So we got to meet in a face-to-face environment, and we still need to have maybe virtual coffee, Zan. We can have virtual coffee, and so in Karan, we can do that as well. But I want to just touch a little bit about it because she does some great work and we shared a lot of good things. And I want to just expand a little bit on a comment that she made in regards to equity, if you don't mind. And I will share this diagram with you. And she hit all the points on this, and I was excited. That's what made me kind of pivot to this, Zan. I wasn't planning this, but we talk about equity. And this diagram shows a lot of what Zan was talking about in terms of equity, and she also touched on social justice. And I like this diagram, and I'm going to get to your answer here. I'll get there. Because it talks about inequity, and then you see that first diagram. So if you just take a second and look at this diagram before I just break it out for you, and what do you see? And just take a second and you see this little process here. But this is done by Dr. Francis. She made some adaptations to a current diagram that's out there. And to me, this shows the path of inequity, equity, to equality, to equity, and to social justice. And this kind of explains a little bit more in regards to what Zan was talking about. And so I'll share inequity, you're looking at this top left corner. I think that's around, 11 o'clock, I guess I'd say. I'm trying to do this in the virtual world. You've got inequity. You can see people playing, and the goal is to try to get some apples. And you can see in an equity situation, somebody's left out. You move to the right, and you're looking at about, 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock. You see what is called equity, but yet sometimes equality, somebody's left out. See, equality is not equity. And sometimes we always mix those up when you talk about defining what equity and equality is. So somebody is still left out of equality. And then you move down to equity, and now you see the ladders have shifted, right? The ladders are different lengths, but it's to promote equity, and now everybody gets a chance to eat an apple. We're still not there yet. We have to get to no barriers, whether it's social justice, whatever the term you want to use. And Zan talked a little bit about social justice office. And then now look at the diagram. You're seeing and I'm going to ask the question. Here's the quiz. What's the big shift? What's the change in this diagram? And I'm not looking at the chat, but maybe people are putting things in there or thinking about it, or you have it in your mind. But the change is the systemic approach. It's the system. The tree has shifted. The ladders are still the same, right? But the tree is now moved, and everybody has an opportunity to get as many apples as they want. It's called systemic change. The key is to move to systemic change. So when you talk about what are some of the programs that you may have done to get to what I think a system of equality and equity, then you've got to make that shift. So you may target one or two things, but the goal has to be to inclusivity and excellence. I always call it, we got to move the tree. You know, the goal is not to do these things. These are cool and they get things started, but at the end of the day, if you don't move the tree, then you haven't had systemic change. So as an institution, when you talk about what we're doing, we have to do some things that are systemic in the work of inclusive excellence to allow us to be able to move the tree. And then so when you move the tree in my office, I'm going to go back to your answer. You wanted some programs. An example could be, I'll show you this. Our Inclusive Excellence Advisory Board, which is made up of 50 people all across the campus. And this is a board layout. You can see the committees and all the work that we do. This is the committee work. And this is how we're trying to transform a system of work within multiple committees and multiple projects, accessibility committee, campus climate committee, to do this work. I'll even be more specific, and I'll go down to awards and scholarships. Here's an example of a presidential inclusive excellence scholarship here, which awards scholarships to students that do the work in the area of inclusive excellence, and they get free tuition to go to school. And then that's open up to all students. It also allows for students that do the work in the diversity space, who sometimes may be a diverse background student, have a scholarship. But this scholarship is awarded to where, in inclusive excellence fashion, everybody gets an opportunity to receive the scholarship. And then we start looking at students' graduation rates and having the ability to get to school and go through college. Another thing I'll share with you, and I'll get off the sharing piece and talk about our hiring process. We're looking at, and I'll go back to that diagram, and if you notice the diagram, there was one bullet that talked about recruitment and retention. We developed a program. We revamped our recruitment strategies and processes to allow us to create a more inclusive hiring process, to hire more diverse faculty at this point we're talking about. And when we did that, we increased our faculty hiring of over 30% this year, diversity of our underrepresented minority faculty. So that was a big shift. The national average is around 5% a year. We went 30%. And then two, we were able to realize in the inclusive excellence fashion, a diverse faculty will allow us to have students to model people that look like them in the classroom. It will also create greater research opportunities because you've got diversity in research. And so you've got people working with different synergies to create a research portfolio for the entire institution. Teaching strategies change. Culture responsive teaching gets infused in the classroom more. Curriculum gets developed. And now you see students benefiting, faculty benefiting, research benefiting, the institution benefiting, and now the entire institution gets an award, if you will, or rises because we have looked at a project of recruiting diverse faculty, which has snowballed into all these positive outcomes that come into place. I mean, I'm a strong believer of the tide rises all boats. And this is an example of how we can rise the tide in the recruitment and the diversity of our faculty, which raises all boats that allow our faculty and staff and students to thrive.
Right, it's of course, right? We can't talk about any of this without talking about representation. And we know in San Antonio, SA 2020 looked at our nonprofit partners, which just make up 3% of the nonprofits in Bexar County. They're predominantly led by white women. We then started working with San Antonio Economic Development Foundation and looking at the corporate sector, predominantly led by white men in San Antonio. So obviously we know, right, that representation allows us to actually design policies and programs that are responsive to the community and increases civic engagement as well. Zan, on that note, you were talking very specifically about systemic racism. Can you tell us, I know the Office of Equity is a part of a national movement of local governments that have been being responsive to organizers and community that have been demanding a race consciousness from local government. What is this leading with race approach that is championed by the Office of Equity? And second to that, why is it important for folks in every other sector to pay attention to what leading with race means or what a race and approach means?
Yeah, great question, Kieran. Because it's such a confusing term, like lead with race, right? What does that mean to lead with race? And so sometimes I rephrase it to say, it really means leading by looking and addressing racial disparities. So looking at racial disparities and addressing racial disparities. So the reason that we do that is because racial disparities are vast, wide, and deep. And if you go back to your question also about targeted universalism, we recognize that if we target racial disparities specifically because they're great, we can actually make improvements that would benefit everybody. So you kind of do this targeted approach by looking at where are disparities the greatest, who's worse off and why, which systems have sort of created the greatest disparities. Target solutions that really attack the root cause. So it's also akin to upstream thinking, right? Why are these systems failing? We don't want to just look at sort of the hospital that people go to when they have a broken arm, but what are all the systems in place that created the broken arm in the first place? And how do we prevent people from having all of these exacerbated disparities that'll bring them to the hospital, just to use an analogy for health. So the city of San Antonio is a member, as Kieran mentioned, of a national movement. So there's an organization called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which has been gaining traction and momentum, as you can imagine, in the last 6 months very rapidly. So local jurisdictions, governments that are state and local jurisdictions join the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. We are over 200 cities and jurisdictions now nationally that have made a commitment to collectively addressing targeted universalism by looking at race and racial disparities. So you join the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and then you make a commitment that your jurisdiction is going to specifically look at race, racism, dismantling racism, and have race-conscious approaches and strategies. So kind of going back to Dr. Anderson's diagram, when you look at these differences between equity, equality, social justice, you might think about decisions that were made that distributed resources equally across the city. So let's use transportation as an example. We used to just give the same amount of money to every council district to do transportation projects, kind of no matter what. It was sort of just 10 million, 10 million, 10 million, you know, the pie, it's the pie equation, right? Equal, 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 everyone gets the same piece of pie. The problem with that approach is that it doesn't look at humans. So I always say equity is about people, right? People in San Antonio don't experience transportation the same way, right? Low-income people, communities of color are less able to access multimodal transportation options, safe transportation options, streets that have, you know, extra safety features like crosswalks and, you know, strong painted medians, connected sidewalks, all these things, right? So if you just give everybody the same piece of pie, you're never going to solve for disparities experienced by our most marginalized, which are low-income communities of color. So how we address that when you sign on to this national movement of leading with race is you say, okay, when we're looking at filling sidewalk gaps, we're not just going to look at how many miles of gaps exist in each neighborhood. We're also going to look at how many people of color live there that are disenfranchised by transportation barriers? How many low-income youth live there that can't get to school because maybe they can't ride their bicycle because there's not connected sidewalks, there's maybe not bike lanes. And then I take it another step further and I say, What are some other barriers they might be experiencing that exacerbate their transportation decisions? It could be that there's stray dogs in their neighborhood that chase them when they ride a skateboard, right? Making it unsafe for them to sort of use these activities that also help improve their health, right? So then you've got these health disparities. They can't bike, they maybe can't walk. There's heat islands because their bus stops aren't covered. So you have to look at all of these things together to recognize that an equality approach to transportation is never going to solve all of these disparities that create poor health outcomes, poor educational outcomes, right? Poor transportation outcomes. So applying an equity methodology to where you might fix sidewalk gaps says, first and foremost, let's address the people and human needs, right? So maybe more money needs to go to fixing sidewalk gaps in our lowest income neighborhoods that have the highest percent of youth of color, so that we can really help them get to school safely. And we can really work with maybe animal care services to maybe prioritize some of the mitigation issues around the stray dogs, because kids should be able to ride their bikes to school, right? And they should be able to sit at the bus stop and not experience high heat and sun and, you know, have exacerbated issues there because there's maybe not a bus stop covering. So that's targeted universalism, because when you do that, when you sort of fix transportation gaps, fix sidewalks, add bus stop coverings, deal with stray dogs that maybe are biting, you're making solutions that benefit everybody, right? So the elderly woman down the street is also really grateful for all of those solutions, because now she can walk with her walker and there's actually a curb ramp and actually a bus stop where she can sit and have some shade, right? So these solutions really benefit everybody when you apply this thinking of leading with race and targeted universalism. And that's how we get to a fair and just San Antonio.
Yes to that. I know Katie is sharing with folks more about leading with race and the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, as well as targeted universalism, which is the perfect start to my day. It makes me so happy. I'm grateful that you're giving us examples of transportation. Zan, my favorite shorthand to describe it is the curb cut effect. I typically, when we're in person and I say the words Judy Babbitt, there's always someone in the audience who has been touched by this woman. She started the City of San Antonio's Disability Access Office decades before there was the American Disabilities Act. Like one of those people that you meet and she just sort of immediately transforms you. She passed away a few years ago, but if anything you see around San Antonio that is about disability access, and particularly around infrastructure and particularly downtown, it was Judy Babbitt's thumbprint and heart that went in terms of organizing behind it. And one of the things that she taught me, which was also a concept coming out of targeted universalism, is this idea that those cuts that you see, known as curb cuts between sidewalks and streets, was institutionalized and made policy through the American Disabilities Act. But we know long before that, it was the activism of disability rights activists that were pouring cement onto sidewalks so that they could be wheeling. So primarily folks with disabilities that were in wheelchairs to be able to wheel safely, right? So absolutely equity was about people. And from 1990 onward, what we found was it's parents with strollers, construction workers with heavy loads. It's just pedestrians, folks that are walking and going out of their way to seek out that curb cut. So thank you both for speaking to that. Jacob, hello, sir. I want to talk to you about Broadway Bank and what we're hearing a lot about during this crisis in terms of essential workers or workforce development or workers, right? Very much carrying the theme about how each of you, as I know and learning about your work, that you're centering people. So earlier this month, shout out to you for working at Broadway Bank, which was named the top workplace for large employers in San Antonio. Okay, that's the place that you're looking at right now by the Express News. We know that in San Antonio, it's about 1/3 of our population. I know Katie shared out the SA 2020 community vision as well as the annual impact report. So we know about 1/3 of our population has an associate's degree or higher. We also know that 65% of jobs require something beyond a high school degree. And so how critical it is, not only through the COVID-19 crisis, but even prior to that, these statistics were very real, and they're just now being compounded by this crisis. So when I saw that Broadway Bank was named Top Workplace, I was excited to be in conversation with you about how does Broadway Bank invest in workers in San Antonio's workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first of all, thank you for the shout out there on the Express News article. I know that that's something the bank is very proud of, especially in 2020 with all the challenges, and to know that the culture and environment has emanated, virtually is something I know that's extremely proud. But to the question, yeah, I mean, the statistics that you're talking about are undeniable. I mean, I think it's you hear the story less and less of somebody who graduates from high school, no post high school education, gets in with a company, works up, and retires. I mean, that exists, but you hear it less and less and less. Eventually, there's going to be an opportunity that is going to require some kind of post high school education to qualify for, and without that, we all know, you hit that ceiling. So from the bank's perspective, I mean, we invest dollars, resources, time in really four main areas: affordable housing, education, and workforce development, which I'll get back to for this particular conversation. But social services and small business and entrepreneurship. But looking at the community as a whole, and specifically in education and workforce development, investing in organizations like Project Quest here in San Antonio that, time after time can produce statistics and show us that, through the workforce development programs that they implement, they can increase, an individual, a family's earning potential to be trained in skilled labor positions and skilled positions that are high in need. So the bank has always had a big commitment there. Was one of the first four founders of Project Quest. So organizations like that who can demonstrate that impact are hugely important. And so the bank continues to invest dollars there, to time. Senior leadership serves on boards and committees for Project Quest and organizations like it. And then obviously in the education realm, that I know our senior leadership feels, that's really such a key, obviously, to unlock those opportunity doors there. Banco Gam was another founder of San Antonio Education Partnership, who's assisting students in need with financial aid, applying for FAFSA, college scholarships, just breaking the barrier to college access. We work with them annually to provide Broadway Bank scholarships to in-need students to attend university. And I'll tell you what, there's not a better feeling in the world than seeing the impact that that scholarship has on somebody, and seeing that seed planted and growing, and then knowing that that individual is going to come back and invest in our community and help our community grow. So yeah, those are really the main areas. I mean, we know that those are the keys to unlocking that potential. And so yeah, we'll continue to invest our dollars, time, and resources in those areas.
Yeah, Jacob, thank you for that. We are Project Quest, such a fan of their work. It's also an SA 2020 nonprofit partner, and you're absolutely right. Project Quest is so community created and community led, very much people focused and people powered, right? And I appreciate so much that they're thinking of the full breadth of services that are necessary, right? All the way down to, hey, transportation is the second highest expense for households in San Antonio. How can we make sure that we're collaborating with VIA so that our students have the access that they need physically to be able to move and get to the places that they need to get to? So grateful to know that Broadway Bank was a part of Project Quest being created and existing. We have a new face. I want to make sure we welcome Jonathan which we've only spoke on the phone before, so I'm excited to see your face. Welcome. Thank you for being here and joining us also from the Office of Equity. So we have I see a couple questions coming through, and actually I'll start with you, Jonathan. I think you'll have some ideas on this. It's a call to action question that I had myself, and I saw it came from one of the attendees in terms of where do we begin? How do we begin to implement equity into the fabric of our organizations? The question on my brain, right, was if you're not the chief equity officer in local government, or you're not chair of the diversity and inclusion committee, what are some access points that folks can consider? And Jonathan, I think you might be muted. You're connecting to audio now. We're gonna come back to you while your audio connects. And Jacob, can I ask you to jump on that? This question of how can folks get started in this work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because I feel like we hear, or I hear over and over again, who's in charge of who implements this? Where does it come from? Does it come from on high? How successful is it if that's the case? And I was really excited to hear Dr. Anderson talk about inclusive excellence. Because I think, over and over again, at least in this short experience I've had with it, that it's everyone's responsibility. It can come, I feel very blessed, that, in my situation, senior leadership has invested in it, it's seen the importance of it, and continues to champion it. But then, if it's just coming from up top, from top down, where it loses some influence, some importance, some factors coming on down. And so really it's from a bottom up approach. And so I feel like even no matter what, even if you're not wearing a inclusivity officer hat or committee leader hat or whatever, it becomes your responsibility to create a environment of inclusivity, of comfortability, from the bottom up. It becomes so important in that aspect, and then it really becomes a reflection of who we are, how we treat each other, how we treat our customers, how we treat our fellow employees. So it starts somewhere, and I feel like it really starts with us individually creating that space.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. We say a lot at SA 2020 we ask folks to consider what is your sphere of influence and control, that we as individuals make up the larger systems we're seeking to change. And what is it? What is the way that we could begin? And I think tuning in today and just hearing the breadth of resources that have been shared is such a great start. And knowing that we need executive leadership on board. It's so important that Chris got us started with the commitment from United Way. And also it's, we know it's not sustainable if it's not led by the community and by people. Thank you for that, Jacob. Jonathan, take it away.
Yeah, good morning, Karen, and thank you again for the invitation. To echo something that Jacob shared, we all play a role in dismantling structural racism. So one of the things that we oftentimes encourage even city staff to think about, and this applies across the board regardless of where you work, is really internalizing the same questions that Zan talked about. Who is worst off? Who will be benefited or burdened by a plan, by a program, by a policy? And what would success look like in terms of really reducing or eliminating racial disparities? You all talked earlier about equity being both a process as well as an outcome. So to me, I don't think it's enough to have equitable policies and programs in place without really authentically engaging communities of color. So we have to also internalize this question: were the communities that experience the greatest barriers involved in developing the solutions? So if we start to internalize anybody can do this, I really do feel that's a great start. And also just normalizing conversations about race in the workplace. So I think that's another thing that we're trying to do. We do that in the city of San Antonio through a train-the-trainer approach, because there's just so many staff. Zan talked about there's 13,000 staff in the city of San Antonio. So we're also trying to build capacity for others to talk about race in the workplace.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. I'm remiss that I didn't give you a proper introduction. I know that you have also a long history of advancing equity. You've done this work in California. You have roots and family here in San Antonio. I'm proving right now that I have a very weird memory. You also have worked in Policy Link, which I know Angela Glover Blackwell is, who also inspired me in understanding what a curb cut effect is. So also just additional resources for that are amazing and national as well as local for folks to plug into. Thank you again for joining us today. Dr. Anderson, we have another question that's come through that I think you've put your brain on, which is about how do we have difficult conversations? If I'm someone who really values equity, values the principles that we're talking about here today, how do I be in conversation with folks in my life, personal and professional, who maybe don't understand what equity means or don't understand its importance? And we're gonna unmute you. Actually, I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
I got it. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I've been doing this for a while. You'd figured I would be able to know that I'm on mute. I don't know.
I thought it wasn't me.
I apologize. I apologize for that. But there's a lot of things there. I want to touch a little bit about the question about how do we get started. But again, I'm an educator, so and I go to this, but it really starts with education across the entire organization. So, and that's the fundamental piece. And then there's also this thing called cultural intelligence. And there's also this thing called cultural competence. So if you look at Cross's work, and I'm not going to show any more diagrams, I have one, but I'm not going to show the diagram. But Cross's work talks about the cultural competence building blocks and how it deals with not just education, but also experiential learning and also professional development and move on and so forth, all into what I call inclusive excellence. So just if we took that cultural intelligence piece, that has to happen across the entire organization. And you have to create opportunities for that. Not one silver bullet, but multiple opportunities, whether it be some mandatory trainings, because of federal law, we have those, and all organizations have to do those, but there's some other ones you can incorporate. So a part of what UTSA has done is we've incorporated cultural competence training as a part of our mandatory training for the entire campus. The goal is to raise the cultural intelligence of the entire institution, of the entire organization. Now, once you do that, now we can have what you're talking about, a conversation, because without that creating an equity of understanding, those conversations become more difficult. Now these conversations, if you look at my hands, they're still difficult. They can be courageous conversations, as we call them, but now the courageousness can come here. And then now we have a fundamental understanding, right? If you want to talk about math, you want people to have the fundamental understanding what math means. Now we can talk about trigonometry, and we can talk about calculus, and we can talk about geometry. But until you have the basic fundamentals of 2 + 2, is 4, we can't even get into trigonometry. Same thing with cultural, with race and cultural competence and diversity. And so, as a diversity officer, though, and I think there needs to be a quarterback or some kind of facilitator, we need to create opportunities to engage structurally and sometimes non-structurally. And so those can be through diversity dialogues, courageous conversation dialogues throughout your organization. And you can have them all the time. And then you can have a person that's trained or facilitating those. You don't want to say, okay, we're just going to have a dialogue and bring some folks in the room and have a dialogue. This is trained stuff. I mean, if I was going to do brain surgery, I would just call up, Jonathan and say, hey, Jonathan, I think you read a book on the brain one day, and I want you to do a surgery today on the brain. And you may, I don't know, Jonathan may be a brain surgeon. I apologize if I get this wrong. But then Jonathan's going to walk into an operating room and start doing surgery. Not going to happen. So same thing with this work. So you need to have the right folks in the room to have these dialogues, because things can happen in these dialogues and they need to be prepared to deal with them. So you need to have that structural piece, but then you also need to create an environment that invites these conversations. We need to tell people, hey, we're trying to become a welcoming and inclusive organization. And we understand that everybody doesn't know everything and they're going to trip a little bit or step on it or say the wrong thing. We need to give everybody a pass. In the spirit of inclusive excellence, if somebody says something, let's don't just assume that it's a targeted negative concept that's going towards hate, but maybe it's a lack of understanding, which goes toward knowledge gain. And let's open that path up so we can start having conversations. And if I make a mistake, it's a mistake, and just correct me. And if we can have a shared agreement that we can have these conversations so we can all learn and benefit, let's look at that and create that environment or movement around the organization. So you got to have the structure, You want to be organized. You want to create those. You want some licensed or trained or people involved with those. But you also want to give a pass for conversations to take place and not look at it as a spirited, hateful thing, more of an understanding thing. And that needs to be communicated to the organization as well. So those are just a couple of things.
Yeah, brilliant. Those are excellent resources, excellent ways to get started. I dropped in also in the chat, there's a tool called ACT, Affirm, Counter, Transform, that I use all day long, every day, personal and professional, to have difficult conversations and engage with folks. And I find such inspiration at SA 2020 when we put the shared community vision in front of folks. People don't look at it and say, no, thank you. And it's such a place to start in terms of shared values and what we want for the future of our city. There's a sentence in there that says that we take shared responsibility for our collective well-being. I think that is very much in the spirit of what it means to advance equity, to know that if we are creating things together in community with and for each other, that they will shift entire outcomes.
Let me say one thing too about a resource, and then I'll let you go. I know you're going to say something. And it doesn't have to be my resource, but I just published a book on microaggressions. And this book talks about tools to help you engage in these types of conversations centered around microaggressions, but also moves into the area of diversity and inclusion. So, but there's other things out there too. So I'm just saying, but those are some ways that you can get a book that gives you tools that you can work on individually to use in how to approach a conversation to where you can have a return on investment in regards to being diplomatic and moving the needle in regards to that understanding. So that's—
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Thank you for that. We're clearly passionate. If you give folks who are passionate about equity a microphone and a captive audience, I feel like I could talk all day about this. I want to give a shout out to Jacob, a shout out to Zan, a shout out to Dr. Myron and to Jonathan for being a part of us today, and more importantly, for leading this work in your respective institutions. I am, as someone who's from San Antonio and cares about our community here, I'm very grateful for the way that you are leading this work in advancing equity. Eric, I pass the mic back to you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate each of you sharing your knowledge and your perspective with the group today. Thank you, of course, for your time and lending your voice and expertise to such a crucial and courageous conversation. I'm confident that many of our attendees today feel the same. Also, just a big thank you to our United Way team, in particular Jordan Thomas, for doing so much of the work that made this event possible. As always, our ELC leaders, Hannah Zunker and Kevin Matula, for their support, and then Katie White, who chairs the subcommittee for professional development. You should see, as we wrap up, you should see a survey pop up on the webinar screen. Please provide us with feedback on how we can make these virtual events more informative or enjoyable for you. And we just also want to provide an update for ELC members. We still have some exclusive events for ELC members. The pandemic has not stopped our ELC Advisory Committee from planning events for you, so please keep an eye out for communications from the United Way team that have more information about those upcoming events and opportunities. And if you've not joined ELC and are interested in joining, please reach out to Jordan Thomas. She's the relationship manager for the Emerging Leaders Council. We can put her information in the chat. And other than that, we'll be respectful of everyone's time and finish on time. Thank you all again, panelists and participants, for showing up, and everyone have a great Wednesday. Thank you.